South Africa has the third largest public sector wage bill as a proportion of the GDP in the world. That's according to a report conducted by the Centre of Risk Analysis late last year. How much more has the Government of National Unity added to the cost, and is there any way to manage this? Our business reporter, Ntokozo Khumalo, joins me now in studio for another budget explainer. Ntokozo, for the size of our economy, why is the public sector wage bill exceeding countries like the United States and Japan?
Good morning, Aldrin. Well, that's certainly what we are hoping to get an explanation on, and how that impacts really the National Treasury's purse when it comes to dealing with some of the issues in the economy, as we've just seen, needing resources to tackle floods and really deliver on public services. According to that report by the Centre, Aldrin, sitting at about 10.5% of GDP, costing the country over 721 billion rand annually. So to help us just wrap our minds around that is Chris Hattingh, who is the Executive Director at the Centre for Risk Analysis. Chris, thank you so much for talking to us. And I think let's start the conversation there, because alarming facts that comes out of the report that our public sector wage bill surpasses even some of the most developed nations, such as the United States. Perhaps just give us a view of how big our public sector wage bill currently is and how it's grown over the years.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this matter, especially in the context of the upcoming budget, the retabled budget that we should have hopefully soon from Finance Minister Ntokozo. So over the years, just in terms of the management and administrative side of South Africa's public sector, that has grown. There have been improvements and growth in the area of frontline workers. So, for example, your teachers, your healthcare professionals, those individuals who have to interact with South African citizens on a day-to-day basis and deliver services to them. But where we see perhaps some of the inefficiencies and the issues is on the management and administrative side, where when that keeps growing and you have more and more bureaucrats and administrators to manage large departments and government services, perhaps some of that spending isn't as effective or efficient as it could be. That doesn't mean it all just goes to waste or corruption. There are very much areas where the public sector does perform well. But if we're looking at getting as much bang for our buck, as it were, in a context of a tight national fiscal space, I think we need to look at where can we reprioritize to make sure that those frontline services aren't the most affected, where many South Africans rely on those services. They can't afford to use the private sector, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll break a little bit how that pie is actually split up, how that public sector wage bill is actually split up, perhaps on a monthly basis. But does the Government of National Unity then not complicate these efforts to try and bring the wage bill down? I mean, Cabinet has now grown from 30 members to 32 members. There are now 43 deputy ministers, up from 36. The Finance Minister himself, his staff has about 10, and the Deputy Minister also having their own staff. So is the GNU not sort of complicating as well that cost of the public sector wage bill?
I think that you're hitting on a very good point. The GNU has complicated very many things in South Africa's economic and political space, which was already very complicated before the formation of the GNU at the end of May last year. But it is the consequence of where we are in our politics. So an era of coalition politics where this government needed to be formed because no single party had an outright majority on its own to form some sort of stable government. Now, if, for example, the cabinet is larger than it has been before, which is the case here, it sets that precedent, and it makes it more difficult when the government, for example, would want to do changes or tweaks to the public sector employment space or to salaries, to the wage bill. It makes that argument a little bit more difficult. So it'll be interesting to see how the various ministers, what comes down from President Ramaphosa and the closest to him in the presidency, how do they convince, especially unions in the public sector, that just because cabinet is larger doesn't mean that this can't filter down into other avenues of reform in terms of the public sector, the size of the public sector, and also the size of salaries there. So it is a bit of a difficult position in which the GNU finds itself. We'll need to see exactly how they can make those arguments and come to those agreements, if they can. If not, it does postpone, I think, some of these more difficult conversations that do need to be had at some point. So either this GNU deals with it, or a future coalition government will be forced to deal with the size and scope of the public sector.
And now, Chris, I'm not sure if you've seen on social media, but, talks often, jokingly, of course, people say, government is probably the best employer in the country because once you're in there, it's hard to get out. Perhaps give us just an understanding of how that pie is spread. As I said earlier on, is it really the public servants on the ground, or should governments also be looking at maybe the high-level officials where money could actually be leaking out in terms of the packages that they receive and the perks that they receive being a government official?
In our assessment, and this report that we published was published last year, so we hope to update it where possible with the necessary figures. We publish regularly what we call the socio-economic survey of South Africa every year. So hopefully that will have updated data and figures specifically on the public sector. But I think you're hitting on a crucial point in terms of spending priorities, where the focus has been more and more on the management and administrative side, and not necessarily on those employees in the public sector who have to deliver frontline services. So are they given the necessary pay increases or other forms of compensation? Are they given the necessary levels of skills training to equip them? Where for us as citizens, when we go and engage with some government services, we get quite frustrated with what we see in terms of a lack of quality of service delivery, but also behind the scenes, are those individuals getting the necessary support, training, to sort of take your pick, that they require to deliver those services, to deal with citizens on a day-to-day basis in a sort of empathetic, but also in a capable manner, in a skilled manner. So I think there's definitely a question to be asked and to be investigated. Also, if we look at just South Africa compared to some other countries, it's not necessarily the case that the public services in other countries, for example, in Europe or Southeast Asia or North America, just function the best. It's more just a case of bang for your buck. So for every rand that we put in the public sector, is the service delivered? Does it justify that rand, for example? So I think that would be a good calculation to look at, to try and figure out, are we getting that necessary bang for our buck? And just if you look at the amount of government spending that goes to the public sector wage bill, does that generate the necessary levels of economic activity, of service delivery that the country requires? We just got the latest GDP figures for 2024 at 0.6% growth. So once again, South Africa, the growth below population growth, we need to pick that up. And part of that is having a very capable and efficient government, and part of that is having an efficient and capable public service.
Well, absolutely, Chris. I think that bang for our buck, especially in regard to the budget, the growing budget deficit, certainly some investigations that need to be done there on where we can draw out some of that money to improve those public services. But that leaves the conversation there for this morning. Thank you so much for your time. Of course, Chris Hattingh is the Executive Director for the Centre for Risk Analysis. And of course, Aldrin, having worked on that report that will be then conducted annually to just see where we are. Chris highlighting there that perhaps we need to investigate a little bit more how that public sector wage bill is spread out and where exactly the money goes to, needing to go to things that will improve the efficiency of the government and, of course, ensure that citizens get the right public services as required. But we'll hear from Finance Minister on the 12th of March when he delivers the budget.